Riddle of the Kiratoch by Sean Parker. Read by the author. Every year, the creatures of the Allbright Forest would gather around the great oak tree to celebrate the winter festival. This year, however, there would be an unexpected intruder in the great forest. A monstrous creature that delighted in devouring small woodland animals. This beast was known as the Kiratoch, and as the animals of the forest prepared for the winter festival, the Kiratoch prepared for its feast. The Kiratoch is a strange sort of monster, likened to that of a mix between a piranha, a shark, and a man. The Kiratoch prefers to trap its prey by bursting out of the water, making it a sort of ambush predator. A Kiratoch's eyes are red like blood. Its body is covered in glistening black fish scales, but the most terrifying aspect of the Kiratoch is its monstrous mouth, filled with row upon row of bladed white teeth. It was during this year's winter festival that a particularly vile and nasty Kiratoch swam through the Brightwood River that ran into the middle of the forest. For this Kiratoch had learned of the winter festival and all the tasty little animals that would have to travel across the shallows of the river to reach the great oak tree. Thus, the cunning Kiratoch waited at the bottom of the river for any poor creature that would try and cross to the other side. It wasn't long of a wait when the first of the forest critters, Mr. Possum, came scuttling towards the river's edge. No sooner did the possum get to the water when there suddenly came a great splashing and bubbling from the depths of the river. The Kiratoch came bursting out of the water and landed in front of Mr. Possum, who was quite scared. The beast looked down at the little possum with its blood-red eyes and cackled.
"What a fine treat you'll make for my critter stew. A bit gamey, but I think you'll do."
In which poor Mr. Possum cried out,
"Oh no! Please don't eat me! Have mercy on me!"
The Kiratoch laughed at the trembling possum, but being a sporting monster, he decided to give the little possum a fair chance.
"Very well, little snack. Answer my riddle, and I shall let you go about your business. But fail, and you'll be an ingredient in my critter stew."
The little possum trembled.
I will try,"
He said meekly.
"Excellent. Then listen well."
The Kiratoch said, then began his riddle.
"What runs but does not walk? What has a bed but does not sleep? What babbles but does not speak?"
The little possum trembled for a moment, thinking desperately. Then he said,
A tree."
The Kiratoch howled in amusement.
"A tree? No, a tree is none of those things."
Then the Kiratoch lifted up a large knotted net.
"You lost the bet. Now get in my net."
The Kiratoch then threw his great fishing nets over the possum and hung him in a tree so that the little possum would be ready when it came time to make the critter stew. The Kiratoch then slithered back into the river and waited, for he was a crafty hunter and knew that the other animals would soon need to cross the river as well to get to the great oak tree. And sure enough, not a few moments later, Mr. Chipmunk came scampering through the forest and made his way to the water's edge. But before he could cross the river, there came a great bubbling from the depths of the water. Then an enormous splash as the Kiratoch erupted from the water and landed in front of the terrified little chipmunk. The Kiratoch growled, his white teeth glistening.
My. What a bite-sized snack you'll make, little chipmunk. A perfect addition to my critter stew. You're a bit tiny, but I think you'll do.
The little chipmunk trembled and then cried out,
Oh, please, please, please don't eat me. I'm hardly a calorie for one as large as you.
Nonsense,
said the Kiratoch.
You may be but a bite, but once I catch the rest of your woodland friends, you'll all make a fine meal together. But I will give you a chance to save yourself. Pass my riddle, and I will let you be. But fail, and you'll become another ingredient for my critter stew.
I will try,
the little chipmunk said as the Kiratoch began his riddle.
What runs but does not walk? What has a bed but does not sleep? What babbles but does not speak?
The little chipmunk pondered this for a moment, and then, nervously, he said,
An acorn.
An acorn? An acorn? No, little snack. An acorn is none of those things. You lost the bet. Now get in my net.
With that, the Kiratoch threw his great fishing nets over the little chipmunk, then hung him up in a tree next to Mr. Possum so that they would be nice and fresh until he was ready to put them in his critter stew. Then the crafty Kiratoch slithered back into the water and waited in the dark depths of the river for the next poor animal to wander by. Within minutes, Mr. Buck began to bound through the forest, his head held high, displaying his proud rack of horns. He came to the river's edge, but was suddenly stopped by the cries of Mr. Possum and Mr. Chipmunk, hung high in a tree.
Oh, boy.
Mr. Buck!
Mr. Buck!
Mr. Buck!
Mr. Buck!
The animals cried out in unison.
What are you two doing in that tree?
Mr. Buck said with a laugh.
No time. It's a trap. Run away. Run away, Mr. Buck.
Too late,
Roared the Kiratoch as he busted out of the river and landed in front of the startled Mr. Buck. Mr. Buck had never seen such a creature in all his years in the Brightwood Forest, but being a proud animal, he stood his ground.
Release my friends now, monster, or face the wrath of my horns.
Mr. Buck demanded as he lowered his head in preparation.
Ha! Those little twigs on your head would hardly suit as a back scratcher for me, but you are more than welcome to try.
The Kiratoch scoffed as he lifted up his large talons in preparation for battle.
So be it.
The buck yelled as he ran towards the Kiratoch, his head held low with his horns glistening. Mr. Buck's horns slammed into the side of the Kiratoch's scaly hide, causing the beast to stumble and grunt.
Not bad, but not good either.
The Kiratoch growled as he backhanded Mr. Buck to the ground. Mr. Buck tried to shamble back up to his feet, But before he could, the Kiratoch struck him down with another mighty blow.
That was amusing. I'd say you're 20 points, Buck, at least. After I've had my fill of your flesh, I'll use your antlers as a toothpick.
The Kiratoch laughed. Mr. Buck then began to cry and plead.
No, wait. I overestimated my abilities and underestimated yours. But my mates and children are already at the great oak tree. Please let me go to them, and you can have the other two you have already caught.
Traitor! Coward!
Yelled Mr. Possum and Mr. Chipmunk from the tree.
You would do the same if you were in my position.
Mr. Buck protested. The Kiratoch rubbed his jaw for a moment, pondering, before he spoke.
Very well, Venison. I will make you a deal. Pass my riddle and I'll let you cross the river unharmed. But fail and you will become another ingredient for my critter stew.
I shall try,
said the pride-hurt Mr. Buck. The Kiratoch smiled a toothy grin, revealing the countless rows of glistening white teeth, and then began his riddle.
What runs but does not walk? What has a bed but does not sleep? What babbles but does not speak?
Upon hearing the riddle, Mr. Buck thought long and hard, and then suddenly realization came over him as he yelled out,
Ha! A cloud!
Upon hearing this, the Kiratoch howled in amusement.
A cloud? A cloud? No, no, no. A cloud is none of those things. You lost the bet. Now get in my net.
With that, the Kiratoch ensnared the proud buck in his net and hung him up in the tree with the others until it was time to make the stew. Now the Kiratoch's appetite was quite ravenous, and he knew he needed only a few more animals to complete his critter stew. His belly rumbling, the Kiratoch then slithered back into the murky depths of the river to wait for his next victim. After a while, there came an enormous tromping through the woods. The branches and twigs began to crack underneath an enormous weight as Mr. Bear came through the forest. Before he made it to the river's edge, however, he heard a shouting and crying coming from high in the branches. When he looked up, he saw the trapped critters crying for help.
Oh, Mr. Bear, thank goodness you're here,
said Mr. Chipmunk, for he knew that Mr. Bear was the strongest and most feared of all the Brightwood animals.
What is this all about?
Growled Mr. Bear.
Some sort of monster trapped us here. We don't know what it is,
said Mr. Buck.
It's big, Mr. Bear. Maybe even bigger than you,
said the terrified Mr. Possum as he swung in his net.
Bigger than me? Ha! We'll see about that.
Mr. Bear growled defiantly.
Indeed we will.
The Kiratoch roared as he leapt from the water and landed in front of Mr. Bear. But unlike the other forest animals, Mr. Bear held his ground. Mr. Bear sized up the Kiratoch, watching the water drip from the creature's slimy scales.
Ha! You're just nothing more than an oversized carp.
Mr. Bear growled through his teeth.
Oh, another fighter, eh? Well, perhaps you'll be a better challenge than that overconfidence, dear.
The Kiratoch growled back at his opponent.
You'll find that I'm more than just a challenge. Now let my friends go, or feel the wrath of my claws.
Mr. Bear roared, standing on his hind legs, revealing his full height.
Perhaps, but first I would like to challenge you to a riddle. You see, we Kiratochs enjoy mental battles as well as physical ones. If you can pass my riddle, there will be no need to fight. I will gladly let you go about your business, and let your friends go as well.
The Kiratoch said, smiling through his pearly white teeth.
Ha! Riddles are for rabbits and other small woodland animals that are too weak to fight and have to rely on guile, but I'll take your riddle anyway,
said Mr. Bear as the Kiratoch laughed, then began his riddle.
Excellent! Then let the riddle begin. What runs but does not walk? What has a bed but does not sleep? What babbles but does not speak?
Then, to the Kiratoch's amazement, the bear spoke without hesitation.
A cave.
He snorted out.
A cave? No. A cave is none of those things.
The Kiratoch said, then readied his largest net.
Well, it looks like you lost the bets. Now, get in my nets. Please.
The Kiratoch said wearily.
If you think you can put me in it.
Mr. Bear growled as he rushed the Kiratoch and started to maul and swipe at the monster with his enormous paws. The Kiratoch and the bear exchanged blow after mighty blow, and even the Brightwood Forest itself trembled with their battle. The other trapped animals cheered on as Mr. Bear continued his fight against the Kiratoch. The ground rumbled with their exchanges. The water itself splashed as they began to roll and tumble about, each one trying to get the upper hand on the other. The two monsters then fell into the river, and there came a great bubbling from the water. The woodland critters trapped in the tree could only watch as the water continued to bubble and turn, and then suddenly grow still across its surface. Agonizing seconds passed as the woodland animals waited, and then they saw a shadow crawling out of the water. To their horror, it was the Kiratoch, wounded but still alive, dragging behind it an enormous net with Mr. Bear trapped inside. The Kiratoch panted as he puts the angry Mr. Bear against the tree with the other animals.
My, you were a challenge, but all you did was work up my appetite,
grumbled the panting Kiratoch.
But your meats will offer the most bulk to my critter stew. Now, just one more little animal and everything will be ready.
The Kiratoch then crept back into the water and waited. The ensnared forest animals all began to cry and moan, for they knew that their end was very soon.
What do we do now?
Said Mr. Possum.
Mr. Bear was the strongest animal. Now no one can save us.
Whined Mr. Chipmunk.
Yeah, he got lucky.
Grunted Mr. Bear.
If only my horns were sharper.
Mr. Buck moaned.
It doesn't matter. We're doomed.
The poor trapped animals all began to cry about their horrible fate. Meanwhile, Mr. Rabbit was hopping through the forest when he heard the commotion coming from the river. Mr. Rabbit had been collecting acorns for the Winter Festival, but when he heard the sound of his fellow woodland friends in trouble, he dropped them and rushed to investigate the noise. When he came to the river's edge, he could see all of his friends hanging from a tree in nets. When they saw him, they began to shout, trying to warn him away.
Get out of here, Mr. Rabbit!
Cried the possum.
Run away! There's a monster in the water!
Howled Mr. Chipmunk.
My horns couldn't even hurt it.
Yelled Mr. Buck.
It was too much even for me, kid. You don't stand a chance. Get out of here while you can.
Mr. Bear roared.
We'll see about that. Where is it?
Mr. Rabbit said defiantly as he glanced about the river for any sign of the Kiratoch. Then there came a great bubbling from the river as an enormous shadow burst through the water. The water continued to bubble and churn as the Kiratoch leapt from it, water droplets falling off of its glistening black scales as it landed in front of Mr. Rabbit, who seemed insignificant in the shadow of the monster. The Kiratoch looked down at the little rabbit. It chattered its multiple teeth together, smiling its most horrible grin, as its blood-red eyes seemed to light up at the last critter for its critter stew.
Look no further, tasty little morsel, for here I am.
The Kiratoch said, allowing the full depth of his enormous shadow to engulf the small little rabbit.
Just as I suspected, a Kiratoch.
Mr. Rabbit said, staring up at the behemoth.
Ah, so you've heard of my kind.
When you've got ears like mine, you hear a few things. And I've learned a lot about your kind. Yours is an evil, yet rare species.
Yes, well, because of our rarity, we must preserve ourselves by eating the flesh of others. Yours, for example, calls out to me, what a tender treat you'll make.
Yeah, well, about that, I kind of had other plans today than being ate by some sort of giant fish monster.
Mr. Rabbit said, with a sly smirk across his face.
Well, that's too bad, for you see, you're the last ingredients for my critter stew. Your tender meat shall make the perfect balance for my meal.
The Kiratoch said as he readied a tiny little net.
Well, it is true that you're very strong, and I can surely not fight something so savage and large as yourself. But I also know that the Kiratoch likes to engage weaker creatures in battles of wit,
said Mr. Rabbit as his ears perked up.
So we do. Your knowledge of my kind is impressive. Very well. Pass my riddle and I will let you go about your business. Fail, and it's in my nets for my critter stew.
The Kiratoch said in amusement.
Bring on your riddle,
said the confident little rabbit. The Kiratoch grunted in skeptical amusement, then began his riddle.
What runs but does not walk? What has a bed but does not sleep? What babbles but does not speak?
Mr. Rabbit paused for a long while, turning the riddle over again and again in his head. Then suddenly, he looked towards the water, and triumphantly, he said,
The answer is a river.
Ha! No, little snack. A river is none of the... Wait, did you say a river?
The Kiratoch said, visibly disturbed. Mr. Rabbit's ears perked up triumphantly as he spoke.
Yeah, a river flows, or runs, but it cannot walk. It has a river bed of rocks and mud, but it does not sleep. And as water flows past rocks and stumps, it makes a trickling, babbling noise, but does not speak.
At this, the Kiratoch became very angry. His eyes turned redder than before, and for a moment, it seemed he might gobble up poor Mr. Rabbit right there on the spot. But instead, the Kiratoch stepped to the side and motioned the rabbit to continue on across the river.
You won the bet. You're safe from my net.
The Kiratoch grumbled, motioning on Mr. Rabbit. Yet Mr. Rabbit remained in place and did not continue. Instead, he looked at the other critters, still trapped in the Kiratoch's nets. The Kiratoch then became impatient and grumbled out,
I said you won. Now leave before I change my mind.
No,
said Mr. Rabbit.
You dare test the patience of a Kiratoch?
Mr. Rabbit smiled, a coy smile, as he glanced back up at the Kiratoch.
Like I said, I know your kind likes to engage in riddles, and since I solved your riddle, I now challenge you to solve mine.
You would give a riddle to me? And what are the stakes, little rabbit?
The Kiratoch said in amusement.
If I win, you must release all those that you have captured and leave Brightwood Forest, never to return.
Interesting. And what if I win? Lucky Rabbit's foot.
The Kiratoch said, lifting an inquisitive brow.
Then I forfeit myself to your precious critter stew.
The Kiratoch pondered for a moment, and then laughed.
It seems unfair to release all of your friends for one riddle.
Are you afraid, Kiratoch?
Nonsense. A Kiratoch fears nothing.
Very well. But since I'm bartering for 4 of my friends, I will give you 4 chances to solve my riddle. That sounds fair, right?
I will solve the riddle in one guess anyway.
Then, do we have a deal?
Mr. Rabbit said curiously.
Very well. I accept. Now let's hear your riddle.
The Kiratoch grunted as Mr. Rabbit began his own riddle.
What can only truly exist in a vacuum is so fragile that even speaking its name can break it, and has been compared to gold, yet cannot be held.
The Kiratoch pondered Mr. Rabbit's riddle for but a moment. Then he spoke out.
Obviously, it's air.
In which Mr. Rabbit replied,
No, air cannot exist in a vacuum. 3 tries, Kiratoch.
The Kiratoch scoffed at this, yelling out,
That was but practice. For you see, it is clearly light because it is golden and cannot be held.
At which Mr. Rabbit replied smugly,
Nope, saying light's name does not break it. 2 more tries, Mr. Kiratoch.
With this, the Kiratoch became quite nervous and started to mumble to himself.
It's clearly, an acorn.
At which Mr. Rabbit laughed.
An acorn? No. An acorn is none of those things. Final try, Mr. Kiratoch.
With that, the Kiratoch became very agitated, and he started pacing back and forth. Then he looked up at the heavens and began to howl and roar. After he got it out of his system, he turned back around and looked at Mr. Rabbit, then cursed at him.
It's impossible. There's no such thing.
Then you're saying you forfeit your final guess?
Yes, because there is no answer, and I will not be fooled by a trick question. Because you tried to cheat me, little rabbit, I'm going to gobble you up on the spot.
The Kiratoch roared as he rushed the little rabbit, its mouth gaping open, its pearly white teeth glistening.
Silence,
Mr. Rabbit said, just as the Kiratoch got within chomping distance.
What's that?
The Kiratoch growled in confusion.
Silence is the answer. It can only truly exist in a vacuum. It is so fragile that even speaking its name can break it, and it has been compared to gold with the phrase, "Silence is golden."
Mr. Rabbit said triumphantly.
But there was...
The Kiratoch grumbled as he stumbled backwards, caught aghast.
You lost the bet. Now let them out of the net,
Mr. Rabbit said as he motioned towards the trapped critters hung from the tree. The Kiratoch grumbled and protested, but he released each and every one of the animals from the tree just as he had promised. Once free, the animals that had been ensnared began to cheer and shout.
"Oh boy, Mr. Rabbit saved us all!"
Cheered Mr. Possum.
"He's a hero!"
said Mr. Chipmunk.
He did what my horns failed to do,
said Mr. Buck.
I may be the strongest animal in the forest, but Mr. Rabbit sure is the smartest,
said Mr. Bear. The animals then all turned and looked over at the Kiratoch, who was quite agitated for losing the riddle. The Kiratoch snorted and scoffed, and was so angry that he leapt back into the water and started to pitch a most horrible fit as he swam away from the Brightwood Forest. Though he was a monster, the Kiratoch kept his word, though he was very unhappy about it. His rage caused the river to turn and bubble, and to this day, the Brightwood River still runs backwards from the Kiratoch's rage. As for Mr. Rabbit and the other animals, they finally made it to the great oak tree to be with their family and friends, and told them of what had happened. And to this day, they still tell the story during the winter festival of the horrible beast and the brave little Mr. Rabbit who outfoxed the monster and solved the riddle of the Kiratoch. The end. December 8th, 2010.